Elena was 68 when the first whispers of pain began to color her mornings. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a stiffness in her fingers as she reached for the teacup on her bedside table, a dull ache in her knees whenever she stood from her favorite armchair. For years, she told herself it was simply age, the price of all those decades spent moving, working, raising children, and carrying life on her shoulders. But one day, as she bent to tie her shoes, the sharp sting in her joints brought her to tears. That was the moment she realized something deeper was unfolding inside her body, something she could no longer ignore. She went to the doctor expecting a quick answer, maybe a prescription to dull the pain. Instead, she left with words that rattled around in her chest: early arthritis, high blood pressure, and rising cholesterol levels. 3 small diagnoses, each one like a pebble dropped into her heart. The ripples carried a heavy message. If she didn't change her path, these little aches and numbers on a chart could quietly steal the joy from her remaining years. I remember the way she described sitting in the car afterward, hands trembling on the steering wheel, staring out at the world as if it had suddenly become heavier, dimmer. For days, Elena carried that fear with her. She began to notice every sign she had once brushed off. The fatigue after climbing the stairs, the way her memory slipped more than before, the restless nights staring at the ceiling. All these threads wove together into a single picture. Her body was crying for help. And yet, she told me later, she felt paralyzed. Where could she begin? Pills alone didn't feel like enough. She wanted to find a way to live, not just to survive. One morning, while visiting the small market near her neighborhood, Elena found herself standing in front of a basket of deep red cherries. Their glossy skins gleamed under the sun, each one like a jewel plucked from summer's heart. She hadn't eaten cherries in years, not since her children were small. Something about them, their rich color, their sweetness, seemed to call to her. She remembered her grandmother saying long ago that cherries were fruit of the heart, though at the time it had only sounded like poetry. On a sudden impulse, she bought a small bag and carried them home. That night, as she ate them slowly at the kitchen table, Elena felt a curious sense of comfort. It wasn't just their taste, though they were sweet with a tart bite that made her smile. It was the thought that maybe, just maybe, something so simple could hold a piece of the healing she longed for. She didn't yet know the science, the studies, the explanations. She only knew that eating those cherries felt like taking a step toward hope. Over the weeks that followed, I watched Elena transform in small, almost invisible ways. The first thing she noticed was her sleep. Nights that had once been restless softened into rest as though her body was finally willing to let go. She would tell me with surprise in her voice, "I actually slept through until morning." Then came mornings with less stiffness in her fingers, afternoons with a lighter mood, evenings where her laughter sounded a little freer. Each shift was subtle, but together they began to weave a new pattern into her life. The change wasn't only in her body, it was in her spirit. For the first time since her diagnosis, Elena felt she wasn't fighting against her health, but walking alongside it. She began to see her bowl of cherries not as a guilty pleasure, but as a daily ritual, a small act of kindness toward herself. The fear she once felt sitting in her car after the doctor's visit began to loosen its grip. In its place, a quiet sense of empowerment took root. I remember visiting her one afternoon when the sun was spilling through her curtains. She had set a bowl of cherries between us, their skins shining like little drops of wine. She told me she had started reading more, learning about how certain foods carried natural compounds that soothed inflammation, supported memory, and even helped the heart beat steady and strong. Her voice carried both wonder and relief, wonder that something so ordinary could hold such secrets, and relief that she didn't need to search for exotic cures or impossible regimens. The answers were often in the simple, familiar things we overlook. Of course, Elena's life wasn't suddenly perfect. There were still mornings where her knees ached, still days when she felt tired. But what changed was her relationship with her body. Instead of despair, she felt she had an ally, small, sweet, and red as summer. She began to plan her meals around colors, filling her plate with what she called living foods. And cherries always had a place among them. Each time she reached for them, she was reminding herself of the choice she had made, not to surrender to decline, but to embrace healing wherever she could find it. In the end, what cherries gave Elena wasn't just a fruit on her table, it was a bridge back to hope. They reminded her that health is not only about prescriptions and diagnoses, but about the daily rituals that nourish both body and soul. They became a symbol of possibility, proof that even when life hands us unwelcome news, we still hold the power to shape our tomorrow. And that, my dear, is why her story matters, because perhaps you too are searching for something small yet powerful to remind you that it's not too late to heal, to rest, to laugh again. So when you see a bowl of cherries, don't just think of them as sweet decoration for summer. Think of Elena, who found in their richness a quiet path back to herself. Think of the way one small change can ripple into many, the way a single choice can begin to mend what fear once broke. And ask yourself, what would happen if you let something so simple, so natural, become part of your journey too? Elena still remembered that day in the doctor's office when her world felt as though it had tilted sideways. The word arthritis hung in the air like an uninvited shadow, accompanied by the warnings of high blood pressure and cholesterol. She sat there nodding, listening to the doctor's calm explanation, but inside her chest a storm had begun. At 68, she had expected some aches, maybe a little slowing down, but not this. It was as if her body had betrayed her quietly, and only now did it decide to confess. Driving home, she noticed details she had ignored before. The stiffness in her grip on the steering wheel, the shallow way she breathed, even the sharpness of the seatbelt against her shoulder. The world felt louder, heavier, as though each sound demanded her attention. By the time she parked in front of her house, the doctor's words replayed again and again. You need to be careful. Lifestyle changes are important now. It sounded simple in his voice, but to Elena it felt like a mountain she wasn't sure she could climb. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table long after dinner was over. Her children had called earlier to check in, their voices warm but distant, each of them busy in their own lives. She didn't want to worry them more than she had to. The truth was, the idea of growing older had always lingered quietly in her mind, but now it had announced itself like a drumbeat. She ran her fingers along the edge of the wooden table, trying to steady her thoughts. The truth was clear, she could not keep living the same way, not if she wanted to keep her independence, her laughter, her sense of self. The next morning, life went on as usual. The neighborhood echoed with the sound of vendors calling out their wares, a sound Elena had grown up with and still found oddly comforting. She decided to take a short walk to the market, something she hadn't done in weeks. The air was cool and crisp, the scent of herbs and spices mixing with the chatter of neighbors. And that's when she saw them, a basket of cherries, their skins glistening in the sunlight, piled high in a woven tray. They were beautiful in a way that made her pause. She hadn't tasted cherries since her children were young, when summers meant bowls of them on the porch and laughter echoing across the yard. Something inside her stirred at the sight. She leaned in, touched one gently, and without thinking twice, asked the vendor for a small bag. As she walked home, she felt an unexpected lightness, as if she had carried with her not just fruit, but a memory, a possibility. That evening, Elena washed a handful of cherries and placed them in a bowl. She sat by the window, the light fading into shades of gold, and popped one into her mouth. The sweetness was immediate, followed by that slight tartness that woke up her tongue. She chewed slowly, savoring it, and for a moment, the heaviness inside her chest softened. She thought of her grandmother, who used to say cherries were a gift from the earth, meant to keep the heart young. Back then, it had sounded like nothing more than an old saying. But now, at this turning point in her life, it felt like a whisper meant for her. In the days that followed, she found herself returning to that bowl more often than she expected. Each time she ate one, she felt she was doing something gentle for herself. She didn't know if it would change anything yet, but it gave her comfort. And comfort, she realized, was its own kind of medicine. Slowly, the narrative in her head began to shift. Instead of repeating the doctor's warnings like a curse, she began to wonder, what if this is not the end of joy, but the beginning of something different? Late one night, when sleep wouldn't come, Elena sat in bed thinking of her future. She imagined herself years ahead, still able to walk through the market, still able to laugh with her grandchildren, still able to enjoy the little things like the taste of cherries on a summer day. And in that vision, she felt something she hadn't felt since her diagnosis: hope, small, fragile, but real. Elena was not the type to dwell on old sayings, but after that first bowl of cherries, her grandmother's words echoed louder than ever. Nature's medicine, she had called them, as if those red gems held a secret the world had forgotten. Elena remembered her grandmother's wrinkled hands, always busy in the garden, her apron pockets filled with herbs and small fruits. She used to place cherries into the children's palms and tell them, "Eat these. They'll keep your heart happy." Back then, Elena had laughed and obeyed, never questioning why. Now, decades later, she wondered if there had been more truth in that wisdom than she realized. She began to read quietly in the evenings, searching not through medical textbooks, but through stories, articles online, memoirs, even a few old journals her neighbor had shared. All spoke of cherries as more than just food. People across Europe and Asia had cherished them for centuries, not only for their taste, but for how they seemed to soothe and restore. Soldiers once drank cherry infusions to ease sore muscles after long marches. Families brewed cherry teas when sleepless nights became too heavy. Even ancient healers had called them the fruit of renewal. These weren't just folk tales, they were fragments of a truth that stretched back through generations. One afternoon, Elena invited her neighbor Marisol for tea. Marisol was in her 70s and had always been full of stories herself, especially about natural remedies passed down from her own family. As they sat at the small table near the window, Elena placed a bowl of cherries between them. Marisol smiled knowingly, almost as if she'd been waiting for this moment. "My mother used to tell me cherries cool the blood," she said, picking one up with delicate fingers. She swore by them whenever summer fevers swept through the town. We didn't have doctors nearby then, only what the earth gave us. They both laughed softly, but in that laughter was a shared recognition that there were truths science hadn't yet caught up with, and that sometimes wisdom lived in the old ways. Elena felt her heart warm with the thought that she wasn't alone in this journey. She wasn't just an aging woman trying to outpace her ailments. She was part of a long chain of people who had looked to nature with trust and reverence. Her children, however, weren't convinced when she first mentioned it. Over Sunday lunch, she told them she had started eating cherries every day. Her son raised his eyebrows, her daughter chuckled. "Mom, cherries aren't medicine," her son said kindly. "You should stick to what the doctor told you." Elena smiled, not offended but amused. "Perhaps," she replied, "but sometimes medicine doesn't come in bottles. Sometimes it grows on trees." Her daughter shook her head but kissed her cheek before leaving. And though they didn't yet understand, Elena felt a quiet certainty bloom inside her. The changes came gradually. She didn't expect miracles, but she began noticing how her body felt less heavy in the mornings. Sleep no longer broke into fragments, but came in longer, more restful stretches. Her moods shifted too. Where fear had lived, now a soft steadiness took its place. She wondered if it was the cherries themselves, or simply the act of choosing something gentle for herself each day. Perhaps it was both. Whatever the reason, she began to trust that she was walking a new path, however small her steps. It was during this time that she visited her doctor again. He checked her blood pressure, noted it had lowered slightly, and smiled. "Good work, Elena. Keep doing what you're doing." She didn't tell him about the cherries, not yet. She wanted to hold that secret a little longer, like a gift between her and her grandmother's memory. But inside, she felt proud, not just for following advice, but for listening to her own heart. One evening, as the sun melted into hues of orange and rose, Elena sat on her balcony with her diary open. She wrote about the cherries, about her grandmother's voice, about Marisol's stories. The words flowed easily, as though her pen was guided by something older than herself. She wrote, "Perhaps medicine is not only what heals the body, but what restores the soul. And perhaps cherries are both." That sentence stayed with her, like a lantern she carried into the darker corners of her mind. When fear tried to whisper again, fear of pain, of aging, of losing her independence, she held on to it. Cherries weren't a cure-all, she knew that, but they were a reminder that healing could be simple, beautiful, even delicious. They were proof that nature had not forgotten her, even if she had forgotten it for a while. By the time Elena finished the bowl that evening, she felt more than nourished. She felt part of something larger, a story that stretched from her grandmother's hands to her own, a story of resilience, of quiet remedies, of hope hidden in plain sight. And as she looked at the last cherry glistening in the fading light, she whispered softly, "Nature's medicine indeed." Dawn slipped into Elena's room like a soft hand parting a curtain, and for the first time in months, she noticed the silence where ache used to live. No shout from the knuckles as she curled her fingers, no hot needle threading her knees when she swung her legs from the bed. She lay very still, testing the moment the way you test a bridge with a cautious footstep. The air had that washed, gentle feeling after a night rain, and the fan hummed a low, faithful lullaby. "Is this real?" she whispered into the new light, afraid to scare it away. She stood, half expecting the old complaint to bark from her joints, but the protest didn't come. In the kitchen, she lifted the kettle and felt something she hadn't felt in a while: confidence. Her grip didn't waver, the metal weight didn't taunt her. A small jar of plum jam, the stubborn one she had left for another day, sat on the counter like a dare. She pressed, twisted, and clicked, the lid yielded. That tiny sound sent a warmth through her chest so sudden she laughed, and the laugh surprised her too. On the table lay a shallow bowl of cherries she'd washed the night before, ruby skin still beaded with a few shy droplets. They looked like they had slept well, patient and bright, a promise rather than a prescription. She carried them to the balcony with her tea and watched the street yawn awake. Scooters stitching the road, a vendor calling about fresh herbs, a neighbor watering a row of basil in dented tins. I remember that morning because when I visited, Elena was standing a little taller, as if some invisible string had been gently tugged from her crown. When she turned to greet me, there wasn't effort in the smile, only light. "Maybe it's nothing," she said, though her eyes were already telling a different story. She flexed her fingers the way a pianist might before a first note. There was grace there, not just relief. We sat, and she told me she'd slept through without waking to stare at the ceiling fan's slow circle. She didn't make declarations or vows. She simply let the morning be what it was: a hint, a nudge, a door cracking open to a room she had thought was locked. After breakfast, she took out her little diary, the one with the pressed ginkgo leaf tucked inside, and wrote a single sentence: "Less pain on waking, held the kettle easily, opened the jam." It wasn't dramatic, and it didn't need to be. You see, the heart believes the evidence it can touch, and that sentence was evidence. She drew a small cherry beside it, 2 linked circles with a stem, a child's sketch, and perfect. The fear that had tattooed itself under her ribs loosened a shade, and gratitude threaded its way in. By late morning, she felt bold enough to try the market hill, the short incline that had embarrassed her a month ago when she'd needed to stop halfway and pretend she was admiring the clouds. She slipped a canvas bag over her shoulder and told herself she would turn back if her knees complained. The sky had the ripe color of a peach, and the road smelled of damp dust and cilantro. Halfway up, habit told her to pause, but her legs kept their easy rhythm. At the crest, she waited for the little stab she knew so well. It didn't come. She set her bag down and laughed again, this time at the simple truth of it. At the fruit stall, the vendor recognized her. "Back again for your jewels?" he teased, lifting a scoop. Today he had 2 kinds, the sweet cherries she had been buying and a smaller, darker variety he called tart and lively. He offered one on his palm and she placed it on her tongue, closing her eyes for a moment. The taste was a bright, clear bell. "These," she said, and asked for an extra ½ kilo. She added greens, a handful of mint, a lemon for her water. This wasn't a crusade, it was a choosing, quiet, deliberate. Near the exit, the small pharmacy kiosk with the automatic blood pressure machine sat like a squat, white sentinel. Elena hesitated, then slipped her arm into the cuff and pressed the button. The machine hummed and squeezed, released and printed. Numbers slid out on a narrow ribbon, ordinary as grocery receipts. She stared and then looked again. The top number was lower than last week, the bottom number too. Not a miracle, not a headline, but a shift. Just enough to feel like the day itself had leaned toward her. She folded the receipt and tucked it behind the ginkgo leaf in her diary. On the walk home, she called her daughter. "I climbed the hill without stopping," she said, aiming for casual and failing because joy kept leaking through the words. There was a pause, then the sweetest thing, a laugh that sounded like Elena's own 25 years ago. "That's wonderful, Mom," her daughter said. "Keep doing whatever you're doing. Want me to come by Sunday? We can take the long way to the park." Plans are promises dressed as afternoons, and this one slipped easily into Elena's pocket. Back in the kitchen, she washed the tart cherries and set aside a small handful for later. The house had the hush of approval, as if it too had been waiting for this day to arrive. She wasn't telling herself stories about cures, she wasn't bargaining with fate or scolding her past. She was standing in a kitchen with a bowl of fruit and a body that had delivered her a message: "I can meet you here, if you'll meet me too." That is how the first sign always feels, less like a trumpet, more like a friend touching your sleeve. When I stopped by that afternoon, she wanted to measure everything. Steps taken, jars open, minutes slept. I held her hands and reminded her that not all counting counts. Let your body have its good day without owing it a report, I said, and she nodded, the way we nod when we recognize a truth we were about to forget. She sliced a few cherries into her yogurt, and we ate in companionable silence. On the sill, the ginkgo leaf glowed a tired gold, a relic of autumn holding space for summer's red. Marisol knocked, carrying a bunch of basil, the stems wrapped in damp paper. For your balcony, she said, and then peered into the bowl on the table. Ah, tart ones. My father swore by those after harvest days. Elena offered her a chair and with a quiet pride told her about the hill and the jam jar and the numbers on the receipt. Marisol clucked her tongue in that affectionate way older friends do. The body loves to be thanked, she said. You're thanking it. They planted the basil together, pressing soil around the roots, and the whole room smelled like green. As dusk unspooled, Elena wrote again, Climb the hill. New cherries, bright taste, numbers better. Laughed twice. She underlined the last sentence because it mattered as much as any measurement. The ache might return tomorrow, she didn't pretend otherwise, but today had placed a stake in the ground, a marker she could touch when fog rolled in. She rubbed a thumb over the ginkgo's veins until they seemed to lift from the page, then closed the diary with a certainty that didn't need to be loud to be true. Before bed, she carried 3 cherries to the window and ate them slowly, a little ceremony she had invented without announcing it to herself. Outside, a scooter whispered past, and somewhere a radio sang an old love song. Elena rinsed the bowl, set it to dry, and turned off the kitchen light. In the hallway mirror, she caught a glimpse of her own face and paused, not to hunt for lines, but to recognize the woman looking back. One who had walked up a hill and opened a stubborn jar and believed a small joy when it knocked. That was the first sign, and it had changed everything, not because it cured her, but because it proved she could begin again. Elena had always thought of her body as a quiet companion, something that moved with her through life without much complaint. But now, after the years of stiffness and fatigue, she had come to realize that silence does not always mean peace. Sometimes the body whispers through discomfort, nudges through fatigue, and shouts only when we have ignored it for too long. She remembered the doctor's words about inflammation, though the term had felt distant, like something belonging to medical journals rather than her daily life. Yet as she began to notice the subtle changes in herself, the lighter mornings, the calmer sleep, she couldn't help but wonder if those whispers of relief were her body's way of telling her something was shifting inside. One afternoon, Elena found herself standing at the kitchen counter, a bowl of cherries before her, when her grandson, Matteo, wandered in. He was 12, curious about everything, always asking questions she could not always answer. He plucked a cherry from the bowl, rolling it between his fingers. "Grandma, why do you eat these every day now? Aren't they just fruit?" She smiled at him, the corners of her eyes softening. "Sometimes the simplest things carry the biggest secrets," she said. "Your great-grandmother used to call them little healers." Matteo grinned and popped one in his mouth. "They taste like candy," he said through a giggle. Elena laughed with him, but in her heart, the moment felt deeper. To see him enjoy them was to see a bridge between her past, her present, and the hope of his future. Later that week, Elena had coffee with her friend Clara at the small cafe near the park. Clara had her own health battles, and their conversations often turned into confessions of aches and triumphs. As they sat beneath the shade of an old tree, Elena described her new ritual with cherries. Clara tilted her head skeptically. "You think fruit can really do all that?" Elena shrugged, stirring her tea. "I don't know if it's the fruit or the act of choosing something good each day, but my mornings feel lighter, my joints don't argue as much. And maybe that's what matters. It feels like a truce between me and my body." Clara softened, pressing Elena's hand gently. "Maybe we all need a truce," she said quietly, as though speaking to herself. It was around this time Elena decided to keep a more intentional diary of her days. Not just the medical details, though she still recorded her blood pressure and sleep. She also wrote about the little victories, the mornings she could button her blouse without fumbling, the afternoons when her walks stretched longer, the evenings when laughter came easier. She noticed a pattern. On days she ate more cherries, her body seemed calmer, her mood brighter. She wasn't sure if this was coincidence, but she knew the difference was real enough to matter. One evening, after preparing a light dinner, Elena sat on the balcony with her notebook. The city hummed below, lights flickering like stars that had chosen to live closer to the ground. She wrote, "I think my body is quieter when I eat them, less heat in my joints, less noise in my mind." She paused, tapped her pen, then underlined the word quieter. It wasn't about erasing every ache or silencing every discomfort. It was about softening the noise enough so that joy could be heard again. Her doctor noticed too. During her next visit, he reviewed her charts and smiled at the small improvements. "Whatever you're doing, keep at it," he said. Elena considered telling him about the cherries, but decided against it. Not out of secrecy, but because she wanted to hold this piece of her journey close, like a private pact between herself and her grandmother's memory. To her, the fruit was more than nutrition. It was a symbol of choosing hope over resignation. The real test came one rainy morning when Elena woke with the familiar stiffness threatening to return. For a moment, fear rushed back in. Was this just a phase, an illusion? She sat quietly, breathing deeply, then reached for the small bowl of cherries she had prepared the night before. The rain tapped steadily on the window as she ate them one by one, slowly, like a meditation. By the time she finished, the pain hadn't vanished, but it had softened, as though the storm inside her joints had calmed to a drizzle. She smiled to herself. Perhaps healing was not about sudden miracles, but about teaching the body how to find peace, even in the rain. That evening, her children came over for dinner. They noticed how animated she was, how her laughter filled the room in a way it hadn't in months. "You seem different, Mom," her daughter said, studying her. Elena only shrugged and reached for another cherry from the bowl at the center of the table. "Maybe I am," she replied. It wasn't a boast, just a quiet truth. The family shared stories, Mateo leaned against her shoulder, and for a while the heaviness of diagnoses and worries dissolved into the warmth of being together. When the house grew quiet after they left, Elena stood by the sink, washing the dishes slowly, humming an old tune. She thought of her grandmother's voice, of Marisol's wisdom, of Clara's hand on hers. She thought of her grandson's laughter, the doctor's surprised smile, her own diary entries. All these threads wove together into a single tapestry, and at the center of it, like a jewel sewn into fabric, were the cherries. Not magic, not myth, just a reminder that sometimes healing begins with a single bite, a choice repeated daily until the body remembers how to breathe again. Before bed, she opened her diary and wrote, "Maybe this is what healing feels like, not a cure, but a softening, not an ending, but a beginning." She closed the book and placed it by her bedside, the ink still fresh, her heart steadier than it had been in a long while. The morning it happened, Elena didn't realize it at first. She rose from bed expecting the usual groan from her knees, that stiff negotiation she had grown used to every single day. But instead, as her feet touched the floor, there was a curious absence, no sharp protest, no dull resistance. She walked to the window almost in disbelief, pulling open the curtains with a swiftness that startled even her. Light spilled across her room, and she stood there for a moment, both grateful and cautious, as if one wrong move might break the spell. Her diary from that week had been filled with questions, little notes that showed how uncertain she still was. Less ache today, coincidence, maybe the cherries, or just a good night of rest. But that morning, she didn't write a question. She wrote a statement, "My joints are quiet. I feel like myself again." It wasn't a permanent victory, she knew that, but it was a taste of freedom, and it stirred something deep within her. Later that day, Elena went to visit her friend Clara again, this time bringing along a small basket of cherries she had bought fresh from the market. Clara noticed her lighter step immediately. "You look different," she said, narrowing her eyes playfully. Elena laughed, handing her the basket. "Maybe I am. Try these." They sat together in Clara's living room, the afternoon sun slanting across the rug, and ate cherries one by one. Elena told her about the morning, about the silence in her joints, about the way it felt like her body had given her a gift she wasn't sure she deserved. Clara listened closely, then leaned back with a sigh. "Maybe your body isn't punishing you anymore," she said softly. "Maybe it's thanking you." That idea lingered with Elena long after she left Clara's house. Could it really be that simple? That the body responds when we treat it with kindness, when we give it what it needs? She thought about how often she had viewed her body as an adversary, a stubborn machine breaking down piece by piece. But what if it wasn't against her at all? What if it had been crying for help, waiting for her to listen? That evening, her grandson Mateo came over after school. He bounded into the kitchen, dropped his backpack with a thud, and immediately reached for the bowl of cherries on the counter. "Grandma, these are the best snack ever," he declared, his fingers already stained red. Elena chuckled, watching him eat. Do you know, she said, that when I was your age, I used to sit in my grandmother's garden, eating cherries right off the branch? She told me they kept her bones strong. Mateo raised an eyebrow in mock seriousness. So you're saying cherries are superhero food? She smiled. Something like that. In that moment, she realized the story wasn't just hers anymore. She was passing it down, a quiet legacy of care disguised as something sweet and simple. The days that followed only confirmed the change. She began to walk longer distances, venturing past the familiar corners of her neighborhood. The bakery at the far end of the street, which had once felt too far, became her new destination. Each step felt like a reclaiming, a small victory against the fear that had once paralyzed her. When she returned home, her knees tired but not defeated, she sat with a cup of tea and a handful of cherries, letting the rhythm of her life settle into something steadier. But perhaps the most profound moment came one night when Elena was preparing for bed. She bent to pick up a dropped towel from the bathroom floor and realized she had done so without wincing. She froze, holding the towel in her hands, tears welling unexpectedly in her eyes. For months, something as ordinary as bending had felt like a negotiation with pain. Now it was just life. She pressed the towel to her chest and whispered a quiet, "Thank you," though she wasn't sure if she was speaking to her body, to the cherries, or to the universe itself. At her next doctor's appointment, the improvements were undeniable. Her blood pressure had steadied further, her cholesterol had shifted downward, and her overall energy seemed brighter. The doctor looked at her, a little puzzled, but pleased. "Whatever you're doing, Elena, keep it up," he said with a smile. She nodded, though she still didn't mention the cherries. Part of her wanted to protect that secret, not because she doubted it, but because it felt like a story too personal, too sacred to be reduced to a line in a medical chart. Instead, she shared it with those who mattered most: her family, her friends, her diary. Her entries grew more confident, her sketches of cherries more playful. Some days she drew them as tiny hearts, other days as bright suns. Each drawing carried the same meaning, the reminder that change, however small, was possible. One weekend, her daughter invited her to join a family picnic. The park was alive with laughter, the scent of grilled food drifting through the air, children chasing kites across the grass. Elena brought a basket of cherries, setting them down beside the sandwiches and juice boxes. As they ate, she watched her grandchildren reach for them, their hands sticky with red juice, their faces lit with delight. She felt an ache then, but not in her joints. It was an ache of gratitude, of knowing she had been given time and that she was using it well. That night, after everyone had gone home, Elena sat on her balcony, watching the stars tremble against the dark sky. She ate the last of the cherries from the basket, each one a reminder of the journey she had begun. The pain in her joints had not disappeared forever. She knew it might return, but she no longer feared it the way she once had. Because now she carried proof that healing, however imperfect, was possible. She had lived it in her bones, felt it in her knees, held it in her hands when the jar lids opened easily. When she closed her diary that night, she wrote one last sentence. "I thought pain was my future, but today I saw it loosen its hold." Then she blew out the candle and let herself rest, her heart steady, her body grateful, her spirit awake to the promise of tomorrow. Elena had spent years resigning herself to restless nights. Sleep had become a stubborn visitor, knocking lightly, stepping halfway in, then slipping away before she could grasp it. More nights than she could count had been spent staring at the ceiling, tracing the lazy circle of the fan blades as her thoughts spun faster than her body could settle. She remembered telling herself that maybe this was simply old age, that she should accept the way fatigue wove itself into her mornings like a permanent thread. But after those first few weeks of her cherry ritual, she noticed something new. The nights no longer stretched into endless battles. The first time she slept through till dawn, she almost didn't believe it. She woke with the pale morning light slanting across her quilt, blinking in confusion. Usually she would have turned over several times, shifted, sighed, and sat up to glance at the clock glowing red on her bedside table. But this time, the numbers told her it was nearly 6. She lay still, her heart fluttering with disbelief, before whispering a quiet thank you to no one in particular. That morning, she rose not sluggish, but refreshed, the kind of energy she had forgotten her body could hold. She didn't rush to tell anyone, not yet. Sleep had been such an elusive treasure that she was afraid speaking of it might scare it off. Instead, she observed quietly, testing each night like a new experiment. Was it a fluke, or was her body finally remembering how to rest? Night after night, the pattern held. Some evenings were still interrupted, but the interruptions grew shorter, fewer, and when she did wake, she found it easier to slip back into dreams, as though her body had learned the art of letting go again. One afternoon, she mentioned it to her neighbor Marisol, almost shyly, over a shared pot of tea. "I think I'm sleeping better," Elena confessed, stirring her cup. Marisol smiled knowingly. "Ah, cherries," she said, nodding. "My mother always told me they carried the night in them. She used to give us a small glass of cherry juice when the summer heat kept us awake." Elena's eyes widened. "She did?" Marisol laughed. "Yes, and we thought it was just another one of her tricks. But now I wonder if she knew something we didn't." Encouraged, Elena began to build a small ritual around her evenings. After dinner, she would wash a handful of cherries, arrange them neatly in a bowl, and eat them slowly while sitting by the window. The act itself became a signal to her body, a gentle unwinding of the day. Some nights she paired them with a short walk outside, listening to the hum of cicadas or the laughter of neighbors gathered in small circles. The cherries were no longer just fruit. They were a thread of calm she wove into her evenings, a reminder that rest was not a luxury, but a birthright. Her daughter noticed the difference during one of their Sunday visits. "Mom, you look brighter," she remarked, pouring tea at the kitchen table. Elena smiled, her hands wrapped loosely around her cup. "I've been sleeping," she said simply. Her daughter's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Really? That's wonderful," Elena nodded, savoring the moment. It wasn't just that her daughter noticed the change, it was that Elena could feel it radiating through her days. With better sleep, her mornings were steadier, her moods lighter, her patience longer. She had more room to laugh, more energy to move. The impact rippled outward. With better rest, Elena found herself drawn to little projects she had abandoned. She reorganized her sewing basket, stitched a loose hem, even began a small embroidery piece she had set aside months before. Each task, once overwhelming in her tiredness, now felt manageable, even enjoyable. "It's like the world has more color," she told Clara during one of their walks. Clara chuckled, squeezing her hand. "Or maybe you can finally see the colors again." One night, Elena dreamed of her grandmother. In the dream, they sat in the old garden, the cherry tree heavy with fruit. Her grandmother reached for a branch, plucked 2 cherries, and placed them in Elena's hands. "Rest, child," she said, her voice warm and familiar. Elena woke with tears in her eyes, the dream lingering like a blessing. She took it as a sign, not a magical promise, but a reminder that the care she gave herself now was part of a thread woven long before her. Still, there were moments of doubt. A week of humid nights left her tossing again, the old restlessness creeping back. Frustration bubbled up, threatening to undo the progress she had felt. But instead of surrendering to despair, she reminded herself of the pattern she had begun to trust. Healing was not a straight line, it was a rhythm, with pauses and repeats, with dips and rises. She held on to the memory of her better mornings, knowing they would return. And they did. At her next doctor's appointment, he remarked again on her improved energy. "Whatever you're doing, Elena, it seems to be working," he said, scribbling notes. She smiled, keeping her secret, but letting herself feel proud. Because for her, this wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about reclaiming her nights, about finding her way back to rest after years of believing it was lost. That evening, she sat on the balcony with Matteo beside her, both of them eating cherries as the stars winked into the sky. "Grandma," he asked between bites, "why do you always save some for the night?" Elena smiled, ruffling his hair. "Because they help me remember how to rest," she said softly. He frowned for a moment, then nodded as if that explanation was enough. And in truth, it was. When she finally prepared for bed, Elena felt no dread about the hours ahead. She knew there might still be nights of wakefulness, but she also knew there would be nights of deep, healing rest. She slipped under the covers, listening to the quiet hum of the night outside her window, and let the weight of her body sink into the mattress. Her last thought before sleep carried her away was simple but profound. I can rest. I deserve rest. And for Elena, that realization was almost as healing as the sleep itself. Elena had never paid much attention to the numbers her doctor read out during checkups. Cholesterol, triglycerides, systolic, diastolic. Those words floated in one ear and out the other for most of her life. She had always been more interested in how she felt than what a slip of paper said. But after her diagnosis, those numbers began to haunt her. Each one felt like a warning sign, a reminder that something invisible was quietly shaping her future. She remembered the heaviness in her chest after hearing the word cholesterol spoken so firmly in the doctor's office. It wasn't the word itself that frightened her. It was the image it painted. Blocked arteries, weakened heart, the slow shrinking of her world. For a while, she tried to ignore it. She told herself she didn't eat terribly, that she still cooked at home, still chose olive oil over butter. But the truth was, she also loved pastries from the bakery at the corner, rich cheeses at family gatherings, and slices of cake shared over tea. Those small indulgences added up, and her numbers showed it. The doctor had warned her gently, prescribing medication and reminding her about lifestyle changes. Elena had nodded, but inside she felt weary. It all sounded like rules, restrictions, a slow stripping away of joy. It was only when she began eating cherries regularly that she noticed something curious. Weeks into her new habit, she returned for another checkup. The doctor reviewed her blood work, eyes narrowing in surprise. "Your cholesterol levels are down," he said, tapping the chart. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Elena's heart lifted, though she kept her face calm. She wanted to believe it was the cherries, but she didn't want to cling to hope too quickly. Still, the thought echoed in her mind long after she left. Maybe something so small could make a difference. At home, she thought about her grandmother again, how she had always believed food could heal if you treated it with respect. "The body knows what it needs," her grandmother used to say, "and the earth gives it if you're willing to listen." Elena sliced open a handful of cherries that evening, their juices staining her fingers red, and wondered if her grandmother had understood something science was only now proving. She ate them slowly, each bite carrying both memory and possibility. The change wasn't only in the numbers, it was in how she felt. Her energy was steadier, her mood lighter. She no longer ended afternoons slumped in her armchair, heavy and sluggish. Instead, she found herself tidying the house, reorganizing shelves, even humming as she folded laundry. These weren't grand acts, but they spoke of a body less burdened, a spirit less weighed down. Her diary filled with small notes. "Less tired today. Breathing feels easier, didn't crave sweets after lunch." They were whispers of change, written in her own hand. One Sunday, during a family lunch, her daughter commented on her plate. "Mom, you didn't take dessert," Elena smiled, lifting a cherry from the bowl at the center of the table. "This is enough for me," she said. Her daughter laughed, shaking her head. "You and your cherries." But Elena noticed the curiosity in her eyes, the way she too reached for a few. It made Elena wonder if the quiet choices we make for ourselves ripple outward, touching those around us without a word. Clara, ever the skeptic, remained unconvinced when Elena told her about her cholesterol improving. "You think cherries did that?" she asked one afternoon during their walk. Elena shrugged. "Maybe, or maybe it's just me paying attention differently. But either way, I feel lighter." Clara studied her, then softened. "Well, whatever it is, it suits you." That was enough. Elena didn't need proof beyond her own experience. The real test came a few weeks later when she returned to the doctor for another round of blood work. She sat nervously in the waiting room, fingers clasped tightly in her lap. When the doctor called her in, he smiled. "Your cholesterol has dropped again," he said, holding up the chart. "This is very good, Elena. Keep doing what you're doing." Relief washed over her, warm and steady. She walked out of the clinic with her shoulders a little straighter, her steps a little lighter. That night, as she sat on her balcony with a bowl of cherries beside her, she thought about what this meant. She knew cherries alone weren't magic, but they had become a symbol of her choice to live differently, to treat her body with kindness instead of resignation. And in return, her body was responding, not with perfection, but with gratitude. She wrote in her diary, "Numbers better again, not just medicine, me too." Then she sketched a small heart beside the words, shading it in with cherry red. The moon rose, pale and luminous, and Elena leaned back in her chair. She closed her eyes, listening to the quiet hum of the city. For the first time in years, she felt she had found not only a weapon against something as shadowy as cholesterol, but also a way to rewrite her story. It wasn't about fighting against her body anymore. It was about fighting for it with gentle, steady choices. And as she ate the last cherry from the bowl, she thought of her grandmother's voice once more, echoing softly. "Nature's medicine," Elena smiled. This time, she believed it. The first time Elena felt her blood pressure rise, it wasn't in a clinic. It was in her kitchen, years before the doctor had given her a diagnosis. She had been trying to fix a stubborn drawer that refused to close, her hands trembling with frustration. her heart pounding too hard against her chest. She had laughed it off then, telling herself it was just stress. But deep down, she knew her body had been sending signals long before anyone wrote them down on a chart. By the time her doctor warned her about hypertension, the signs were everywhere. Lightheaded moments, flushed cheeks, and that quiet, steady thump that seemed louder than it should be. "It's dangerous if we don't manage it," he had said, tapping the paper with her results. Elena had nodded, masking her fear with composure. But when she went home that day, she sat by the window for hours, listening to her pulse in her ears, wondering how much time she had before it betrayed her completely. That was before the cherries, before she discovered how something so simple could shift the rhythm of her days. She hadn't expected them to do anything for her blood pressure, not really. But one evening, after weeks of her quiet cherry ritual, she decided to stop by the small kiosk in the market where they kept the automatic blood pressure machine. She slipped her arm into the cuff, pressed the button, and waited. When the numbers rolled out, she blinked, then checked again. Lower, not perfect, but lower than the last time. She folded the slip of paper with trembling hands and tucked it into her diary. At first, she thought it was just a coincidence. Maybe she had walked more that week, maybe she had slept better. But the pattern repeated itself. Each time she checked, the numbers inched downward as though her body was quietly responding to her choices. The cherries weren't magic, she reminded herself, but perhaps they were helping her body remember how to breathe again. Her daughter noticed her calmer demeanor one afternoon during a visit. They were cooking together, Elena slicing tomatoes while her daughter stirred soup. "You seem less tense, Mom," her daughter said, glancing at her. Elena chuckled softly. "Maybe I am. My blood pressure's been better lately." Her daughter's eyes widened. "Really? That's wonderful." Elena nodded, lifting a cherry from the small bowl she kept near her cutting board. "Maybe these little ones are helping." Her daughter laughed, shaking her head. "You and your cherries. Next, you'll be telling me they cure everything." Elena only smiled, chewing thoughtfully. She didn't need her daughter to believe it. She only needed to feel it for herself. And she did. The change wasn't only in the numbers, it was in her everyday life. She no longer felt that pressing heaviness in her chest during stressful moments. The constant tension in her shoulders eased. When she climbed the stairs, her breath steadied quicker than before. These were small victories, but they stitched together into something larger, a life no longer dominated by fear of the next spike, the next dizzy spell. One evening, her neighbor Marisol stopped by with a handful of herbs. They sat together on the balcony, sipping tea, the air thick with the scent of basil and mint. Elena told her about the lowered blood pressure readings, about how her body felt calmer. Marisol nodded knowingly. "My father used to say, the heart listens to what we feed it. If you feed it stress, it races. If you feed it kindness, it slows." Elena tilted her head thoughtfully. "And cherries count as kindness?" Marisol grinned. "Most definitely." The ritual deepened for Elena after that conversation. She began pairing her evening bowl of cherries with a few minutes of slow breathing. She would sit in her chair, close her eyes, and eat each cherry with attention, tasting its sweetness, noticing the rhythm of her breath. It was no longer just food, it was meditation, a way to speak gently to her body. And her body, in turn, seemed to listen. Weeks later, at her doctor's appointment, the improvement was clear. "Your blood pressure is much more stable," he remarked, scanning the chart. "You're making real progress, Elena." She felt warmth bloom in her chest, a mix of relief and pride. For years, she had felt powerless against those numbers, but now, with something as simple as a handful of cherries, she was reclaiming control. That night, she sat by her window, diary open, pen in hand. She wrote, "Numbers steadier, less pounding in my chest, less fear." She drew a small sketch of a cherry beside the words, shading it carefully until the page seemed to glow with its red promise. Closing the book, she leaned back and watched the moon rise. For Elena, it wasn't about erasing her diagnosis or pretending she was cured. It was about living with a lighter heart, about finding calm where there had once been only worry. The cherries were her reminder that healing doesn't always come in grand gestures. It can come in small, steady choices that whisper to the body, "I am listening, I am trying, you are safe." As she finished her evening bowl, the night air cool against her skin, Elena felt her pulse steady, gentle as a lullaby. For the first time in a long time, she trusted that her body was no longer racing against her. It was walking with her step by step, cherry by cherry. Elena had always had a sweet tooth. She loved the warmth of freshly baked bread, the way honey dripped lazily from a spoon, the comfort of a slice of cake with her afternoon tea. For years, those small pleasures felt harmless, little rewards she offered herself after long days of raising children, managing a household, and later navigating the quiet that followed when the house grew empty. But as her body aged, those pleasures began to feel less like gifts and more like risks. When her doctor warned her that her blood sugar levels were creeping higher than they should, Elena felt a shiver run through her. Diabetes. It was a word she had heard too often in whispers from neighbors and relatives, a condition that seemed to steal joy from so many lives. For days after that appointment, she found herself staring at her plate with unease. Was the rice too much? Should she skip dessert entirely? Food, once a source of comfort, now carried a shadow. She missed the freedom of eating without fear, without calculation. And yet, deep down, she knew she couldn't keep living as she had before. Something had to change. The cherries had already become part of her daily ritual, but she hadn't thought of them as anything beyond a comfort and a helper for her joints, her sleep, her blood pressure. It was only when she began reading more, small articles, notes from health journals, that she realized they might also be a shield against the creeping shadow of diabetes. Their sweetness was different, balanced, steady. They didn't send her into that dizzy rush she sometimes felt after indulging in pastries. Instead, they left her feeling satisfied, calm, her energy even. She tested this one quiet afternoon. Normally, after lunch, she would reach for a biscuit or two, something to pair with her tea. But instead, she set a bowl of cherries before her. She ate them slowly, one by one, savoring their juicy burst, their tart sweetness. Then she waited. Half an hour later, her body felt steady, not weighed down, not racing. She wrote in her diary, "Cherries after lunch, no heaviness, no crash." It seemed like a small note, but to Elena, it was a revelation. Her daughter noticed the change as well. During one Sunday visit, she poured tea while Elena set a plate of cherries on the table. "No cake today?" her daughter teased gently. Elena smiled. "This is enough for me." Her daughter blinked, surprised. "You? Turning down cake?" Elena chuckled. "I still love it. But these," she said, lifting a cherry, "they love me back." They both laughed, but the words rang true. For the first time in years, Elena felt she wasn't at war with her own cravings. The difference showed up in her next blood test. Her doctor leaned back in his chair, scanning the numbers. "Your sugar levels are holding steady, even improving slightly," he said with cautious optimism. Elena felt a bloom of relief in her chest. She didn't confess that cherries were her secret weapon, but inside she marveled at how something so ordinary could shift the course of her health. Her friend Clara remained curious. "So you're telling me fruit can control sugar?" she asked one afternoon, eyebrows raised. Elena shook her head. "Not control, but guide. I don't feel the same spikes and crashes. I don't feel punished for wanting something sweet." Clara thought about that for a moment, then reached for a cherry from the bowl between them. "Well, if that's true, I may need to borrow your trick," she said, popping it into her mouth. For Elena, the shift wasn't only about numbers or tests, it was about reclaiming joy in eating. She no longer dreaded the hours after a meal, no longer braced herself for the sluggish heaviness that once followed. Instead, she felt free to savor food again, trusting that her choices were helping her, not hurting her. The cherries became her small rebellion against fear, her way of saying, "I can still enjoy sweetness, but on my terms." One evening, as she sat on her balcony with Matteo, she offered him a bowl of cherries instead of the cookies he usually begged for. He looked skeptical at first, but took one, chewing thoughtfully. "These are good," he admitted, licking the juice from his fingers. Elena smiled. "See? Sweet doesn't always need sugar." He grinned. "Grandma, you're turning into a health coach." They both laughed, the sound carrying into the evening air. But Elena knew the truth. She wasn't trying to be a coach. She was simply learning, step by step, how to live in harmony with her body again. At her next family gathering, she brought a large bowl of cherries to share. At first, her relatives teased her. Elena and her cherries. But by the end of the afternoon, the bowl was empty, little stems scattered across the table. She watched her family eat them with delight, her grandchildren giggling as their lips stained red, and she felt something settle in her heart. It wasn't just about her anymore. This small fruit was weaving itself into the fabric of her family, becoming part of the memories they would carry. That night, she wrote in her diary, "Sweetness without fear, my body calmer, my heart lighter." She closed the book, smiling to herself. The cherries had become more than food. They were a quiet shield, protecting her from a future she once feared, giving her back the freedom to savor life's sweetness without dread. And that, she realized, was a gift beyond measure. Elena had always prided herself on being steady. Through the ups and downs of raising children, the loss of her husband, and the long stretches of solitude that followed, she had managed to keep her emotions anchored. But in recent years, she noticed how easily her moods shifted, how quickly the world could tilt. Some mornings she would wake with a heaviness in her chest, as if a gray veil had settled over everything she saw. Other days, small irritations, an unanswered phone call, a stubborn stain on her blouse, would swell into storms that left her exhausted. She had once thought strength meant pretending everything was fine. Now she realized it took more courage to admit when her spirit was weary. The turning point came quietly, not as a revelation, but as a gradual noticing. She had been eating cherries daily for weeks now, first for her joints, then for her sleep, her blood pressure, her sugar levels. What she hadn't expected was how they seemed to soften the sharp edges of her days. She would sit by the window in the late afternoon, a bowl of cherries beside her, and notice that her thoughts felt lighter. The heaviness that once pressed down on her chest loosened. Her mind didn't spiral so quickly into worry. It was subtle, but real. One afternoon, her daughter stopped by with Matteo. They sat at the table together, Elena slicing bread while Matteo chattered about school. Her daughter leaned back, studying her. "You seem happier, Mom," she said suddenly, almost surprised. Elena paused, knife in hand. "Do I?" Her daughter nodded. "Yes. Less tense. More you." Elena smiled, a small warmth spreading through her. She hadn't realized others could see it too. It wasn't just inside her, it was visible, reflected back through her family's eyes. Later that evening, Elena sat on her balcony, reflecting on her daughter's words. She thought about how often she had dismissed her own moods as unimportant, believing that emotional well-being was secondary to physical health. But now she understood they were woven together. When her body felt calmer, her spirit lifted. And when her spirit lifted, her body seemed to follow. The cherries had become a bridge between the two, carrying her from heaviness to lightness with each small bite. Clara noticed it as well. During their walks, Elena found herself laughing more, sharing stories with a liveliness that had been missing. Clara teased her one day, "Whatever's in those cherries, I want some." Elena chuckled, handing her a handful she had tucked into her bag. "Maybe they remind me to savor things again," she said. Clara nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe that's all we need sometimes." They walked on in companionable silence, the sound of their footsteps steady against the pavement. There were still days when the gray veil threatened to return. Elena didn't deny it, but now she had something to meet it with, a ritual, a reminder, a sweetness that pulled her gently back toward balance. On those days, she would eat her cherries slowly, focusing on their tart burst, the way their juice stained her fingertips, the way her body seemed to soften with each bite. It wasn't about curing sadness, it was about creating space for joy to return. One evening, she shared a bowl of cherries with Matteo while they watched the sunset. He leaned against her shoulder, quiet for once, his usual chatter replaced by stillness. "Grandma," he said softly, "you smile more now." Elena kissed the top of his head, her eyes misting. "Maybe I just remembered how," she whispered. In that moment, she realized the gift wasn't only for her. Her lifted moods touched her family too. Her lightness became their lightness. At her next doctor's appointment, he commented again on her progress, noting how her overall health seemed steadier. Elena smiled, deciding not to mention the cherries once more. Some things were better kept as stories, not statistics. On her way home, she thought about how healing often comes in unexpected ways, not in loud declarations or grand changes, but in small, daily rituals that restore both body and soul. That night, Elena opened her diary and wrote, "Laughed with Clara today." Matteo noticed my smile, less weight in my chest. She drew a small sun beside the words, shading it in carefully. For her, this was the true measure of progress, not only the numbers on a chart, but the warmth returning to her spirit. As she ate her evening cherries by the window, the city lights flickering like fireflies below, she felt gratitude rise within her. Not just for the fruit itself, but for what it represented. the reminder that healing wasn't only about fighting illness, but about reclaiming joy. And as she finished the last cherry, licking its sweetness from her lips, she whispered softly to herself, "I am lighter now." Elena had always been proud of her sharp mind. She remembered the tiniest details, birthdays, the exact shade of her daughter's wedding dress, even the words of old songs she hadn't heard in decades. But as the years passed, she began to notice the small slips, a misplaced key, a name that lingered just out of reach on her tongue, a story she'd already told twice without realizing. At first, she laughed them off. Senior moments, she called them with a shrug. But beneath the humor was a quiet fear. What if I lose myself piece by piece? That fear grew sharper one evening when she forgot the stove was on. Nothing serious happened, only a pot boiling dry and leaving a faint scorch mark, but the incident rattled her. She sat in her chair afterward, hands trembling, replaying the scene in her mind. "Is this how it begins?" she whispered into the empty room. The thought was heavy, almost unbearable. Not long after, she began reading more about memory and aging. Articles spoke of how diet and lifestyle could shape the brain's health, how the foods we choose might protect or harm our memory. It wasn't the jargon that stayed with her, but the possibility. Maybe she still had some power in this. And so, when she reached for her cherries each evening, she wondered if they could do more than soothe her body. Could they also guard her mind? She began to test herself in small ways. She played word games with Mateo, challenging herself to recall tricky vocabulary. She tried memorizing short poems, repeating them as she walked through her neighborhood. She noticed that her focus felt clearer on days when she had eaten her cherries faithfully, her mind less foggy, her thoughts more fluid. She wasn't claiming miracles, but she could feel the difference. One afternoon, she confided her fears to Clara during their walk. "I worry about forgetting," Elena admitted, her voice low. Clara squeezed her arm gently. "We all worry about that," she said, "but I've noticed you're sharper lately, not duller." Elena blinked in surprise. "You think so?" Clara nodded. "You remember the smallest things, even what I wore last week." They laughed together, the sound lightening the weight of Elena's fear. At her next family gathering, Elena tested herself quietly. She told her granddaughter a story from her own childhood, how she once climbed too high in her grandmother's cherry tree and had to be rescued. As she spoke, the details poured out easily, the smell of the leaves, the roughness of the bark, the panic and relief when she was lifted down. Her granddaughter giggled, eyes wide with delight. In that moment, Elena felt relief wash over her. Her memories weren't gone. They were alive, waiting for her to bring them forward. Her doctor, during a routine checkup, asked how she was managing day to day. Elena smiled. "I feel clearer," she said simply. He nodded, noting her response. But she didn't explain further. She didn't tell him about the bowl of cherries beside her every evening, about the way their ruby glow seemed to anchor her thoughts. It wasn't something she needed to justify, it was something she simply lived. At home, she began writing more deliberately in her diary, capturing not just her health, but her memories. She filled pages with stories from her youth, her first bicycle, the way her mother's hand smelled of soap and flour, the lullabies her husband used to hum. Each entry felt like a gift to herself, a reassurance that her mind still held treasures waiting to be unlocked. And each evening, as she ate her cherries, she thought of them as keys, small, sweet keys keeping the doors of her memory open. One evening, Mateo sat beside her on the balcony as she wrote. "Grandma, why do you write so much lately?" he asked. She smiled, closing her diary. "So I don't forget," she said gently. He tilted his head. "Forget what?" Elena stroked his hair. "All the beautiful things that made me who I am." He leaned against her shoulder, quiet for a while, then whispered, "Then I'll help you remember too." Tears filled her eyes, but she let them fall silently, her heart swelling with gratitude. That night, Elena wrote in her diary, "Fear of forgetting lessons, stories still alive. Memory like a garden, tends better with care." She drew a small cherry tree beside the words, its branches reaching upward. For Elena, the lesson was simple but profound. Memory wasn't only about clinging tightly to the past. It was about nourishing the mind so it could carry the past forward, weaving it into the present. And each cherry she ate became part of that nourishment, a symbol of her determination to hold on to herself, not just in body, but in spirit, in memory, in story. Elena had never thought much about what she couldn't see. Wrinkles on her skin, yes, the gray in her hair, of course. But the invisible things, the wear and tear happening quietly inside her body, felt too abstract, too distant. It was only after her diagnoses that she began to realize how much of aging happens in silence. Her doctor had mentioned oxidative stress once, explaining it in careful words she barely understood. But what stuck with her wasn't the terminology, it was the idea that tiny battles were happening in her cells every single day. She left the office with a chill, wondering how many of those battles she had already lost without knowing it. The thought weighed on her for weeks. She found herself lying awake at night, picturing her body as a battlefield, invisible sparks flying, damage accumulating like rust on metal. It frightened her more than she wanted to admit, but as she sat with her evening bowl of cherries, she began to imagine them differently, not just as fruit, but as allies, small but powerful. She thought of their deep red color, rich as wine, and wondered if their beauty was more than surface deep. One afternoon, she shared this thought with Marisol while they tended to the basil on her balcony. "Do you think food can protect us from what we can't see?" Elena asked, her hands gently pressing soil around the roots. Marisol looked thoughtful. "My grandmother used to say some foods shine light inside the body," she said. "They chase away shadows we don't even know are there." Elena smiled at the image. Light chasing shadows. That was something she could understand, something she could believe. The changes in Elena's life were not dramatic like in the movies. They were subtle, steady, like a quiet tide washing away debris. Her skin, once prone to dullness, seemed to glow a little more in the mornings. Her energy lasted longer into the evenings. Even her eyes, Clara noted one day, looked clearer, brighter. Elena laughed it off, but inside she felt a flicker of pride. Perhaps these small cherries really were shining light in places she couldn't see. She noticed, too, how her resilience seemed stronger. After a long day of errands, she no longer collapsed into her chair, utterly drained. When a minor cold swept through the neighborhood, she recovered quicker than she expected. These weren't coincidences, she thought. They were signs, gentle but steady, that her body was responding to the care she was giving it. One evening, as she peeled a handful of cherries for her dessert, Mateo sat beside her with curious eyes. "Grandma, why do you always eat these?" he asked. Elena smiled. "Because they help me fight battles inside my body." He frowned. "What battles?" She tapped his chest gently. "The kind you can't see, but that matter the most." He nodded solemnly, as if she had just shared a great secret. And maybe she had. Her doctor, during her next checkup, remarked again on her improved energy and steady progress. "You're taking good care of yourself," he said, flipping through her chart. Elena nodded, holding her secret close. She didn't need to explain that it wasn't just medicine and walks, it was also the quiet ritual of cherries, the way they had become her daily shield. That night, she sat on her balcony, diary open in her lap. The city buzzed softly below, and the air carried the faint scent of rain. She wrote, "I cannot see the battles inside me, but I feel their quiet victories, less fatigue, brighter days, lighter steps." She drew a small flame beside the words, symbolizing the light she imagined chasing away her inner shadows. She reflected on how much fear had once filled her after hearing those clinical words from her doctor. Now, instead of fear, she felt partnership with her body, with the food she chose, with the earth itself. She no longer imagined herself rusting quietly away. Instead, she saw herself as a garden being tended, fed, protected, renewed. The bowl of cherries at her side glowed in the dim light, their skins like small lanterns. She ate them slowly, savoring their sweetness, and whispered softly to herself, "You are my little warriors." She laughed at the silliness of it, but in her heart, she knew it was true. And as the night deepened, Elena felt peace settle over her, not because she believed she had defeated time, but because she had found a way to live in harmony with it, to give her body what it needed to fight its silent battles. In that harmony, she discovered something she hadn't felt in years: safety. Elena had always been attuned to her heart, not in a medical sense, but in the way she listened to it through moments of joy and grief. She remembered how it had fluttered the first time she held her newborn daughter, how it had ached quietly the day her husband passed, how it had swelled with pride when Mateo recited his first poem to her. Her heart had carried her through everything, a faithful companion she often took for granted. But after her doctor warned her about her rising risks, blood pressure, cholesterol, age itself, she began to listen in a different way. Each thud of her pulse became a reminder of how fragile, yet how precious, this rhythm truly was. The fear of losing it sometimes crept in at night when the house was silent and her thoughts had space to wander. She would place her hand on her chest, feeling the steady beat beneath her palm, and whisper a silent prayer, "Stay strong. Stay with me." It wasn't fear alone that guided her choices, though. It was love. Love for the moments still waiting for her, for the laughter of her grandchildren, for the mornings when the sun slipped gently through her curtains. She didn't just want to survive, she wanted to keep living fully, heart steady and open. By now, cherries had become woven into the fabric of her days. She ate them without thinking, the way one drinks water or takes a breath. But one evening, after another encouraging doctor's visit, she began to reflect on how deeply they had touched her life. Her cholesterol had improved, her blood pressure steadied, her energy returned. And as she sat with her bowl of cherries by the window, she realized that in some small way, they were protecting the very rhythm of her life, her heartbeat. The connection became clearer to her during a walk with Clara. They paused halfway up the hill, not out of breath, but simply to admire the view. Clara remarked, "Do you notice how much easier this feels now?" Elena smiled, nodding. "Yes, I used to feel my heart racing by this point. Now it feels calmer." Clara studied her for a moment, then said, "You glow, Elena, truly." Elena laughed, brushing off the compliment, but inside she felt a warmth that was more than physical. It was the quiet joy of knowing her heart was no longer burdened as it once had been. At a family dinner, her son teased her gently about her cherry obsession. "Mom, you must be single-handedly keeping the cherry farmers in business," he joked. Elena chuckled, holding up one of the glossy fruits. "Maybe so, but if it means I get to see you all for many more dinners like this, I'd say it's worth it." The table grew quiet for a moment, her words settling into the air with weight. Then her daughter reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "We want that too, Mom," she said softly. Elena's throat tightened, but she smiled, grateful for the unspoken bond that moment sealed. One evening, Mateo asked her the kind of question only a child could. They were sitting together, sharing cherries as the stars appeared. "Grandma, how long will your heart beat?" he asked innocently, resting his head against her arm. Elena paused, taken aback. She looked down at him, his eyes wide with trust, and said gently, "As long as it can, and maybe longer if I take care of it." He nodded, seemingly satisfied, before popping another cherry into his mouth. But for Elena, the question lingered. It wasn't about how many years were left, it was about how she filled them, how she honored each beat while it was still hers. Her diary entries during this time reflected that shift. She no longer wrote only about symptoms or numbers. Instead, she wrote about moments, walked uphill without breathlessness, laughed so hard at Mateo's joke my chest ached in a good way, heart steady even in the night. Each entry felt like a love letter to her own heartbeat, a recognition of how precious each rhythm was. Marisol noticed it too. Over tea one afternoon, she leaned across the table and said, "Your spirit feels lighter these days. Do you know why?" Elena thought for a moment, then replied, "Because I stopped waiting for my heart to fail me. I started giving it reasons to stay." Marisol smiled, eyes glistening, and raised her cup in a quiet toast. "Too many more reasons," she said. That night, Elena sat with her cherries, the city lights glowing softly below her balcony. She placed a hand on her chest, feeling the steady beat beneath her palm. She thought of her grandmother's words, of her doctor's surprise, of her family's laughter. She thought of all the moments still waiting to be lived. And she whispered once more, "Stay strong, stay with me." For Elena, the cherries were never about perfection or guarantees. They were about partnership, about reminding her heart that she hadn't forgotten it, that she was still listening, still caring. They were her way of protecting the rhythm that carried her through life, one cherry at a time, one heartbeat at a time. Elena had never thought of herself as an athlete. Her exercise over the years had been practical, walking to the market, bending in the garden, carrying laundry baskets up the stairs. She admired the dedication of runners and cyclists she saw on television, but their world felt far away from hers. That is, until she stumbled upon an article while flipping through an old magazine in the waiting room at her doctor's office. The story described how athletes were turning to tart cherry juice to recover from grueling workouts, praising its ability to ease muscle soreness and speed healing. Elena had smiled at the irony. If it works for their tired muscles, she thought, maybe it can help mine too. The truth was, she knew the stiffness after even small tasks all too well. A day of heavy cooking left her shoulders tight. A walk up the hill often lingered in her knees for hours afterward. She had grown used to rationing her energy, carefully balancing activity with the promise of rest. But when she read about athletes using cherries to bounce back faster, something stirred inside her. Maybe strength wasn't only for the young and the competitive. Maybe recovery belonged to anyone who gave their body the tools to heal. She decided to put the idea to the test. The very next day, she walked further than usual, circling the park twice instead of once. By evening, she braced herself for the usual stiffness, but as she sat with her evening bowl of cherries, she felt a curiosity she hadn't felt in years, an eagerness to see what tomorrow would bring. When she woke the next morning, the soreness was there, but muted, softer, as if her body had been given a helping hand overnight. She stretched her arms above her head, surprised by how much easier it felt. Encouraged, Elena made cherries a regular part of her post-activity routine. Whether it was gardening, tidying the house, or chasing after Mateo in the park, she followed up with her little bowl of red allies. Over time, she noticed a pattern. Her muscles no longer ached as fiercely, her joints no longer felt as inflamed. She could enjoy movement again without fearing the price she would pay later. It was a freedom she hadn't realized she had lost, and one she was grateful to reclaim. Clara noticed it first during their walks. "You're keeping pace with me better these days," she remarked, a hint of admiration in her voice. Elena grinned. "Maybe I've joined the athletes club," she joked, lifting a cherry from her pocket. Clara laughed, but there was truth in the humor. Elena was discovering that recovery wasn't reserved for marathoners and sprinters. It was a gift available to anyone willing to nourish their body in simple, consistent ways. Her grandchildren began to tease her lovingly. "Grandma, are you training for the Olympics?" Mateo asked one afternoon as she played tag with him in the garden. She laughed so hard she had to wipe tears from her eyes. "Not the Olympics," she said, catching her breath, "just for life." That answer seemed to satisfy him, and together they collapsed onto the grass, a bowl of cherries between them, their laughter echoing into the warm evening. The difference was not only physical. With each new sign of recovery, Elena's confidence grew. She no longer hesitated to join her family on outings, no longer declined invitations out of fear of being too sore afterward. She said yes more often, to walks, to games, to life. The cherries had become more than food. They were a bridge back to freedom, a reminder that her body was still capable of joy. One evening, Marisol stopped by after seeing Elena pruning her balcony plants with surprising vigor. "You've been busy," she said with a smile. Elena wiped her hands on her apron. "I'm not afraid of the soreness anymore," she admitted. "I recover quicker. It's like my body forgives me faster." Marisol nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps it's not forgiveness," she said. "Perhaps it's gratitude." That night, Elena wrote in her diary, "Walked further, gardened longer, laughed louder, recovery faster than before. I feel free again." She drew a small sketch of a runner, smiling at the thought of herself as part of that world, even in her own quiet way. As she ate her evening cherries, she reflected on the strange connection between her and those athletes she had once admired from afar. They sought recovery to push their limits. She sought it to reclaim her life. Yet in both cases, the cherries offered the same gift, the chance to move, to live, to keep going without fear. And in that realization, she felt a kinship she hadn't expected. For Elena, it wasn't about medals or finish lines. It was about mornings without dread, afternoons filled with movement, evenings spent laughing with her family. It was about proving to herself that recovery wasn't beyond her reach, that even at her age, her body could still surprise her with its strength. As the stars appeared over her balcony, she ate the last cherry in her bowl and whispered softly, "Here's to my own kind of victory." And in her heart, she knew it was just as worthy as any gold medal. The season was turning when Elena realized just how far she had come. Summer's heat softened into autumn's crisp air, and with it came the markets overflowing with the last harvest of cherries. She stood before the baskets, their deep crimson skins gleaming like jewels against the fading light, and felt a pang of gratitude swell in her chest. Months ago, she had stumbled upon them out of impulse, almost by accident. Now they felt like companions, silent allies that had walked beside her through pain, fear, and healing. Carrying a small bag home, she thought about how different her life felt now compared to the day she left the doctor's office with trembling hands. Back then, the word arthritis had sounded like a sentence, the warnings about blood pressure and cholesterol like a heavy chain around her neck. She had sat in her car paralyzed with dread, unsure of where to begin. Now, as the cool breeze brushed her cheeks, she walked with steady steps, her shoulders lifted, her heart calm. She hadn't escaped age, but she had learned to walk with it, to make peace with its lessons. At home, she set the cherries on the table and brewed herself a cup of tea. She ate the first one slowly, savoring its sweetness, the way its juice spread across her tongue. With each bite, memories came rushing back, her grandmother's voice calling them nature's medicine, Mateo's laughter as he declared them superhero food, Clara's knowing smile during their walks, Marisol's gentle wisdom about gratitude. These memories weren't just about cherries, they were about the journey they had carried her through, one bite at a time. Her family noticed the transformation most of all. At their Sunday lunch, her daughter looked at her and said, "Mom, you seem stronger, happier. It's like you found yourself again." Elena smiled, reaching for a cherry from the bowl at the center of the table. "Maybe I have," she replied. Her son added, "Whatever you're doing, it's working, you're glowing." They all laughed, but behind the laughter was something deeper. Recognition. They had seen her struggle, seen her dim under the weight of illness and fear. Now they were seeing her light again. That evening, Mateo curled up beside her on the balcony. "Grandma," he said softly, "do you think cherries will help me when I'm old like you?" She laughed, brushing his hair from his forehead. "I hope you won't wait until then, but yes, I think they'll remind you of me, and of how small things can make a big difference." He nodded solemnly, as if tucking the promise away in his heart. She kissed his head, tears pricking her eyes, realizing this was the legacy she was leaving. Not wealth or possessions, but a story, a reminder, a habit of care. Later that night, Elena opened her diary for what felt like the 100th time since this journey began. The pages were filled with her handwriting, notes of pain and progress, sketches of cherries and hearts, stories of laughter and healing. She flipped through them slowly, tracing the arc of her own transformation. Finally, she turned to a fresh page and wrote, "I began in fear, but I end in gratitude. These small fruits taught me to listen, to hope, to heal. Tomorrow is unknown, but today I choose life." She closed the book and set it gently on her bedside table. The room was quiet, the only sound the steady rhythm of her heart. She placed her hand over her chest, feeling its calm beat, and smiled. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges, as every tomorrow does. But tonight, she had her bowl of cherries, her memories, her laughter, her peace. That was enough. Before bed, she ate the last cherry from her bowl, letting its sweetness linger as a promise. A promise that healing wasn't about grand cures, but about small, faithful choices repeated day after day. A promise that even in the face of aging and illness, life still offered gifts, bright, red, and full of possibility. And as she turned out the light, Elena whispered softly into the darkness, one bite at a time. Elena's story began in fear of aching joints, rising blood pressure, troubling cholesterol, and the quiet whisper of age catching up faster than she expected. That fear could have held her back, but instead, it became the doorway to transformation. What started as a simple impulse to buy a bag of cherries from the market turned into something much more, a daily ritual of care, a reminder that even the smallest choices can carry profound healing power. Through her journey, we watched the turning points unfold. The first morning, she woke with less pain in her joints. The night, she slept deeply and peacefully after years of restless tossing. The checkups where her blood pressure steadied, her cholesterol improved, and her sugar levels no longer climbed so sharply. But perhaps the greatest change was not in the numbers, it was in Elena's spirit. Her laughter returned, her confidence grew, her heart felt lighter, and her memories shone clearer. She rediscovered not only her health, but also her joy, her resilience, and her place within her family's story. Elena's journey is a gentle reminder. Healing rarely comes as a single miracle. It comes in small, steady choices, one step, one meal, one bite at a time. Cherries were not magic, but they became her symbol of listening to her body, honoring its needs, and choosing life over fear. And so, if you take one message from her story, Let it be this: it's never too late to begin again. No matter your age, no matter your struggles, small daily actions can open the door to renewal. Your tomorrow can still change. Your body is listening, waiting for your kindness. One bite, one step, one choice, that is how healing begins.